please let me know.
There's still
Ready
a
to
ton
go?
of pizzas.
What's that?
There's still a ton of pizzas. So.
Yeah, there's also a ton of pizza, so please eat it so I don't have to take it home and have my fiance yell at me.
If your fiance yells at you for free pizza, you might want to rethink the
Well, she thinks it makes her fat. So.
All right, so I think I left off randomly that who knows what domain-driven design is? Or at least who's heard of domain-driven design? Has everyone implemented it in any of the projects they're working on or anything like that, or is it just something you've heard about? So it's a philosophy of development based around taking, modeling your actual application after the business rules and the workflow of the business that you're providing a solution for. And that the whole set of rules governing is called the domain. And so that's where it gets the name domain-driven design. There's a few good books out there. Vernon Vaughn, he wrote Distilling Domain-Driven Design, and he gave a presentation on it this year's Code Stop that was pretty good. It's really, really good for solving business problems and making sure that both the developers and the business owners are speaking the same language. One of the first things that you do is you develop ubiquitous language between the development team and the business owners, so everyone's speaking the same language. So, for example, with this project called the ROG, it's the whole concept of it is behind it is rating and reviewing politicians. So there's a core domain in there revolving around politicians and reviewing them. And so I would actually model the program after that. So I would have a class called politicians, and then there's business logic inside my class that mimics whatever the workflow is, like politician, rate politician, update name, or stuff like that. And so you take all of your business logic and you bundle that up in your classes in your domain name, and then everything else is controllers and services and stuff like that. So the first drawing I'm going to show you guys tonight is, so this is a domain map, which after speaking with the domain expert, the business owner over there, I come up with a domain map, and I just take all of the entities that are involved in the application and map these out and what their properties are going to be. And that way there's a strong business rule going into this. So for example, politicians will have IDs, they'll have a name, they'll have an office, it's going to be a string, they'll have a state, photo, etc. like that. The offices that are valid for the domain are Senate, House of Representatives, President, or unelected, because there's no other offices as far as Congress is concerned like that. Same thing with state, it would have 50 states. And then that way there's and we'll go into the domain later, but having everything defined like this lets you create business rules in the domain for the application to just make things more tightly woven together and makes more sense. And so when you talk about this stuff with whoever you're developing for it, you're able to use the same words that they are, so they completely understand what you're saying, even if they have no idea, about software. We'll go ahead and we'll start with some setup for the project. So that's something I want to be talked about. Generally, I use Puppet and Vagrant to make development environments on the local machine. For this one, I wanted to try out Laravel Homestead. I've not done it before. It works off of Vagrant, but it doesn't use Puppet. It uses bash commands beforehand. And that's something that you can download or clone off of Laravel's Git repository. And it follows the same purpose as Vagrant and Puppet. So you'll need to have two things installed on your machine. You'll need a provider. VirtualBox is the free one. You can also use VMware, but that costs money. They're starting support with Hyper-V on Windows systems. And then you need to have Vagrant installed. And from there, you define a Vagrant file, which has the configuration for whatever kind of server that you want to have. And that gets checked into your repository. So then, if you have to move to another computer, or you have to redo this one, or if someone joins the team, they can just check out the code, type in Vagrant up, and it'll create the development machine on their computer for you with your specifications. So I have a 4-point blog post about using Vagrant and Puppet to do just this on my website, theanticritics.com, if anyone's interested in reading reading more about that. So I'll just start up the virtual machine. And it'll read the configuration files that I have here and go ahead and do that. There's other services that do the same thing, Chef, Ansible, Docker, I think does the same thing, but also like takes it way, way farther and like packages everything up so you can move that around servers and stuff like that. So. This is about a default homestead configuration, but I added two things myself to it that I use. First, I added by default, your options for your Laravel database are MySQL, Postgres, SQLite. I like to use document-based databases, so I've got MongoDB running on this, and so that's something that I needed to add additional to Mongo. And then I use Capistrano for deployment, which requires Ruby, so I added a Ruby module to the homestead machine also for doing that. So now the machine's booted. And so the page should load. So this is all development environment running on the local machine. So with that. So we'll go back into the stack here. I said Laravel is the back end. I'm also using Laravel for the front end. One of the concerns for the business owner was SEO. Typically, I would use Angularjs front ends. It's a lot faster and easier for me, but it sucks at SEO. You have to use another service like PreRenderIO to redirect the crawlers to the pre-rendered JavaScript in order to get the search rates on there. So for the front end of this, I'm using Laravel's late syntax. That way, everything's rendered in PHP, and it's a lot easier for SEO. There's a couple parts we'll go through that has some interactivity with the user and the site that I did use Angular for. I just brought it in for those parts. And then I'm using MongoDB on the back end. So is everyone familiar with document database systems like Raven or Mongo? I can go on that for a minute if someone wants to. So typically, if you're using a SQL-based system, everything's stored in tables, and then there's relationship tables. And when you want to get something or put something into the database, you have to break it up and put it into these tables. A document-based database system like Mongo or RavenDB takes your entire object, serializes the JSON, and then stores it on a file. And so then that way, when you query and get that information back, it's giving you the entire object and just deserializing it from JSON. The advantages of this are, one, your objects are being stored into the database the way that they're represented in the program. So I can show you that here, see what that looks like. And the big analogy is that between MySQL and a document database system is that if you're storing a car and you use MySQL, it's going to give you the wheels, it's going to give you the chassis, here's the engine, you got to put that back together. Mongo's like, well, here's a car. So here's the database structure for the politicians in Mongo. Big enough everyone can read it. So you'll see it's actually, it's everything's stored right here. If I go to edit JSON, you'll see that it's just a JSON object with all the properties of the politician class filled in for this particular politician with an ID. So it's really, document database systems are really fast, so they're good for large-scale projects. They're also easier to replicate and scale to other servers versus MySQL. So there's just some of the advantages. I wouldn't use it for tabular data, like financial applications. MySQL or other SQL-based databases are still going to be great for that because that's how the data is represented. So any questions on Mongo before I continue on?
Is that the only disadvantage you would say?
In my mind, yeah. I mean, another one is that RavenDB is the equivalent on the .NET stack we use that a lot, and that's getting a lot of traction and popularity. Mongo's open source version of it, and there's a big community around it, but it doesn't have some of the advantages that Raven, being a commercial project, does. Like this program here is I had to purchase the license for this. There's no graphical interface that ships with Mongo. And so you're either doing it through the command line, which is kind of cumbersome, especially with the JSON syntax versus that. But I typically use it for every project that I can at this. Yeah.
What happens with like a version 2.0 of your product when you've added more properties to your objects?
Well, there's two things. If they're not required properties, it's not going to matter. Anything that gets new will have those properties or not. When it reads something from the database and the property doesn't exist, it's just a null value. So if you add a required field, then you would write a script that would patch the database. I do have an example of that. Don't I, Everett? Which I'm going to have to find. Because in the CMS product that I developed, we had that come up. So this is a patch. So what we actually did here is we had a venue object, and the venue had a street, address, city, state, zip, and phone, and that was all top level on the venue object. What we actually wanted to do afterwards was create another venue object and put all that in there to better organize the object. So we had to patch that in the database to get back to a valid domain state. So all this does, it just takes all the objects from all the site objects from the database, loops through them, sets up the new venue array with the information, and then unsets the old values. And that's just run through the command. That's just run through a command line using PHP. Laravel's Artisan command task run stuff. So patches are a little bit of a pain in the butt, but there's a lot of other things that outweigh it. One, there's no schema, so you don't have to worry about if I'm going to add a new property to it. I'll have to go update the schema and do a migration, stuff like that. If it's not a required property, you can just add it.
So you're not doing migrations at all? You're not using the migrations option in Artisan at all?
There's no need for it. I use the seeder to seed the database, but since there's no schema, there's no migrations.
Yeah.
It just takes a JSON, it just takes an object and serializes it to the database. So that was that. Any other questions on that before we move on? So, all right, let's dive into the actual domain here. Let me know once I pull up code if you guys can actually read this. So let me back up to a little bit in the idea of entities in a domain. So any domain object is referred to as an entity. All right, guys, thanks for showing up. Good talk. You can ask me any questions I have after the presentation. I'll be happy to answer those. And
I have no idea what it is.
but while you're figuring that out, I can talk about this. There's different types of object in a domain. Entities are any kind of object that has an ID. And then you have value objects, which don't have an ID. The big difference between the two are that entities are mutable, so they'll be taking changes. Those are your big daddy domain objects. And then you have value objects which aren't immutable. They can just be thrown away. So if you make a change to a value object, you just basically override whatever the values of that object are. It's on there. So then you take all of these entities and value objects and you form aggregates. And that's how things interact with the domain, how your services and stuff will act with the domain. So for this example, which I can't show anymore, but we have politician, which is an entity. We have office, which is a value object, state's a value object, political party, that's all a value object. I would never query the database or use any kind of service or controller to access the offices, because those are just dummy values that don't matter.
It'll come on in a second.
Okay. So everything is going to get queried through the politician. So the politician becomes the aggregate root. All of that together is an aggregate, and then the politician is the aggregate root, which is the entry into the domain from controllers or services or factories or whatever that you're doing there. Warm it up, guys. Oh, anyone have any questions about that? Because that can kind of get a little confusing there.
You just mentioned aggregate root.
Yes.
Is there only one of those all the time?
No, you can have multiple aggregate roots, but that's not a problem. You can have multiple aggregates, which is a collection of all the different objects, but each one's only going to have one aggregate root, which is going to be the entry level. This is back on, so the projectors themselves are. There we go.
Oh, they turned green, so I hope that, there we go.
So you can have multiple aggregates, but every aggregate will only have one aggregate root.
You may need to force it to ship that on your machine to mirror the display again.
I think it's waiting for the.
Could be. There it
There we
is.
go. Okay. So we can go back to my drawer in here, and you'll see here that I've got an aggregate defined sort of with this politician class because it references office, state, and party, which are value objects in the system. So politician becomes the aggregate root, politician, office, party, state. That's all aggregate together. So, and you'll see that the politician has an ID, whereas office, party, and state doesn't. Those are basically just enumerators, which isn't a enums don't exist in PHP. I use them a lot in the .NET world, and they're highly valuable for things. And I wrote, this is on GitHub, I wrote a way to kind of do a cheap enum in PHP. An enum is a class that's all it is a collection of values. So think of it kind of as an array, but more strongly typed. And it's good for when you want to take input into a class and make it restricted to certain values. So this is a state. So here's an enum I created for all the states. So it's all defined values. I want to be able to be sure that when a state gets updated on a politician, it's got to be one of these values. So this is an easy way to do it. I just make an enum of all the possible values, and then when we get into the politician, we'll see that there's validation in there that checks to make sure that it's a value, it's a valid value of this enum. So, without further ado, the text big enough for everyone to read? Make it larger. There's also presentation mode, but it's kind of butt. You guys read that?
It's better.
All right. So this is the politician domain object. You'll see that it extends an entity. What I did is I created a base entity model that has a getter and setter for the ID, since every entity is by definition required to have an ID. And a little helper function here to make sure that a string coming in isn't null or empty space. So, so all entities will extend that. So then here you'll see I've got properties. I've got all the properties defined. This is taking advantage of Laravel's eloquent syntax, which in itself is a blessing and a curse. So there's still some stuff I'm struggling with a domain-driven design with Eloquent, but I think I'm pretty close to it. So then everything is accessed through a getter and a setter. I don't ever access the values directly. One of the big reasons for that is validation. So you'll see when set name, if the name's empty, then my domain's an invalid state because a politician always has a name, and they'll let you know about it. So things get validated. So here's an example of validating the enum. So that office is another enum. So you'll see it has preset values that it can be. And then when the office of a politician is set, it makes sure the first that it's not empty, and then it checks to see if it's a valid value of the office enum before it sets it. And this is pretty much, this is the core of domain-driven design.
all of this is business logic. This is all the business rules for the website, and it's all contained within the domain. There's nothing outside. I don't have to go anywhere to see, well, what's valid to have on a politician. What kind of values can be in office? It's all contained within that domain object. The big challenge that I'm facing right now with Eloquent and domain-driven design are constructors. The way that Eloquent works is when it queries something from the database, it needs to have a parameterless constructor, because it then uses an Eloquent method called fill to take all that information and then fill in the information for the class before returning it. With domain-driven design, you don't want to be able to new up a domain object if it's an invalid domain object. You just want it to quit right there. And so I think I've worked around this, but I wasn't able to for this project. But as you'll see, there's no constructor here. So in this example of politician, there's some required fields: name, state, office, party. They're all required fields. A politician has to have those. And so if a politician object gets created and doesn't have one of those, the domain's invalid. And so other things in the program are going to break. So typically you would put that in your constructor and have your constructor return or throw an exception if it's in valid state. I wasn't able to do that with Eloquent, but one of the common patterns with Laravel is the repository pattern, where you put all of your database logic in a repository class. And I kind of use that to enforce domain rules when I create a new object. So I have a politician repository. And inside this politician repository, there's a make function. So there is where I'm requiring a name, state, office, party. I'm setting some default values for some other non-required fields. And then I'm creating a new politician. And then setting all of the information. So it's going through those validation rules that I have defined on the domain object. And then I'm saving it to the database right there. And so I don't like this, because now I have business logic outside of my domain. Now my business logic is inside a class whose responsibility is to just read and write information to the database. So that's a separation of concerns issue right there, and that's something that I'm working for. Does anyone have any questions on that? So either I did a horrible job or a great job explaining all of that. So, let me exit presentation right here. There it is. And so that in itself, that's kind of the core of domain-driven design. You have a bunch of domain classes that define all of your business logic, and then everything else plays into and out of that. So I can kind of do some workflow for the program here.
Well, I guess, wait a minute, I guess I do have a question
Okay.
about that. Real quick, before you jump away, sorry that I didn't say it before you close those windows, but how did that adjustment with the repository pattern affect how your unit tests were written? Did you have to change anything to sort of—
This project is not unit tested
Okay.
because I wasn't getting paid to unit test.
So there's no problem.
So there's no problem here. So typically your domain objects themselves will be unit tested themselves. You could unit test the repository pattern or your repositories in that case, but typically you wouldn't unit test repositories because they're just dumb classes. They're just basically a wrapper for the database and do that. So if all the stars were aligned and there was a constructor there, then in the domain object, then you'd write unit tests against the domain and against the controllers and the kind of service and factories that they have there, but not the repository.
Have you looked at writing a custom Laravel validators? I know you can specify like a certain validator applying to a certain field, and then could you then make those fields required so that when you knew it up, it would throw an exception, or maybe you could run like a validation?
I've done different things with the Laravel validator. I've defined a static array of rules on an object, and then new up a validator and pass the rules in the object with the validator. The problem with that is now your business logic isn't in your domain still. Now it's in that validator class.
Yeah.
So it's another option
Gotcha.
to get around the whole constructor thing. I can go ahead and talk about what I'm going to try in another project with. So like I said, the big hurdle there is that Eloquent requires a parameterless constructor, that it can just new up an empty object and then use the Eloquent fill property to fill in all the attributes to it. So one of the things that I thought about doing is taking a constructor and all the parameters, make them all optional parameters on the constructor. That way, when Eloquent news up the object, it'll just ignore those and do it the normal way. But any interaction that I have through controllers or whatnot would go through the constructor. It's kind of weak, and so I'm not sure how that's going to work out. Another thing that I'm looking at is there's another software library called Doctrine, which implements domain-driven design as an ORM. There's a packet. There's a drop-in package to use Doctrine with Laravel. There's a drop-in package to use Doctrine with Mongo. There's not one that does the two. So another thing that I thought about doing was forking the projects, combining them, and making a Laravel MongoDB Doctrine library. But that's a huge undertaking, and it'll take a long time to get that working. You can, like I said, you can use Doctrine with Laravel. It would replace your Eloquent syntax, and you can use it with MySQL or Postgres or SQL-based databases that way.
Do you know if there are any like post-fill events that I guess that would still have? Maybe you could put your validation function on your domain and then have like after the entity gets filled.
I've messed around with with overriding the boot function on the objects before for some other reasons. Like at one point, I was trying to do some self-validation on save whenever Eloquent tried to save an object, and it would work. But you're taking business logic and you're putting it away in this really obscure corner,
right? Where
it's going to be hard coming back later, like figuring out, what's going on here? Why isn't this validating the way that I would? I don't see any rules like that. So it's a little bit harder to track down things like that. But it's an option. But trying to get all of those rules inside your domain is the best path to go, because then you have one place that has all of the business rules and all of the logic, and it's pretty much the Bible for your application. Any changes that you make that update your domain objects need to be taken seriously and vetted, and because there's going to be a lot of refactoring when you update the domain like that. Once you have your domain mapped out, sometimes for projects we've spent like 2 or 3 months just mapping out a domain before we even started development. It's because it's that crucial to the process that we're using. So we had a product team come up and talk to us today. So event booking, we make calendar software for the entertainment industry, and so we have a product that's for promoters, and it's an online calendar for concert promoters to book and track their shows. And so one of our domain objects is a venue, because that's where a promoter works, is at a venue. And so the calendar is based upon that venue. There's no concept of a calendar in the program. It's all a venue, and there's dates at the venue. We just have the view just happens to be a calendar grid, but there's no calendar in the system. One of the product team says that he was talking to a venue, and the way that they do their booking now is they have 2 separate calendars, one for daytime shows, one for nighttime shows, and was wondering if, can we do that in the system? And, immediately we're like, well, no, that's not something we're going to be able to support, because we don't have calendars. We would have to enter that as 2 different venues. They're not 2 different physical venues. So other business logic that we have revolving around reporting box office tickets would break, because these two now calendars aren't tied to an actual physical venue in other APIs. So that's one of the let's say, that would be a huge domain change. We would have had to refactor pretty much the entire application to support this. So it's something we can go back and say, this is not something that our software is intended to do. If no one has any other questions, we can just go through part of the application from front end to back end to see how everything flows together. So I'll show you the ratings page, because it's got a little bit of everything on it. This is something I'm dealing with now. It was pretty. There's 535 members of Congress, and there's I think 26 presidential candidates right now. So that is a lot of photos that gets loaded on page load here. This is showing the House of Representatives, which itself is 435 members of Congress. I didn't know any of this before I started this application. Now I'm intimately familiar with it. So we'll look at this profile page here for Adam B. Schiff. He's in California, so no one should get upset that I'm giving him a favor here or anything like that. And so it displays a photo, a little bio, what his average ratings are. No one's rated him yet. And then there is a ratings form here. So the two parts of the ratings form is first, he wanted politicians to be able to rate individually on the 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights. So there are 10 Liberty Bells. Are you guys noticing the theme here? That they can be rated on. Since most people probably don't know what the amendments are, there's a little tooltip that goes over that actually explains what that amendment is. And then you can rate the different bells how you want to. You can type in a review and you can submit it. Down here, it'll show what the latest reviews are for that politician. And so that's the functionality of this. So I'll just take you through from the view file all the way to the back, just to show how everything else is working within the domain. Laravel 5 has a little bit different of a structure, which is probably one of the reasons that you are having problems with upgrading. Views are now stored under this resources folder. So instead of under the public folder like they were before. So anyone upgrading, that's gotcha. So here's Laravel for their view rendering. It has the blade syntax, which is similar to Razor on .NET, which I'm pretty sure that's how they got the name. And so this is a blade syntax template file, mostly HTML, and then you can see some of this stuff here that suspiciously looks like Angular JS, because I believe that is. Nope, this isn't. Blade syntax uses handlebars just like Angular does, so it can be confusing. And so, but I promise you, this is Blade. This is all PHP. So this is the equivalent of doing a PHP echo right there. Here's a for loop, blah blah blah. You can see some stuff like that. But anyways, so we can see here that down here it does an authentication check, because if someone's not registered and log in, they can't rate, obviously. So it does a check on that. But then the actual form itself is handled by an AngularJS directive here. So, so right now what we're still looking at, this is all PHP, and then right here is one of the two places that I bring in AngularJS. So here's the directive for the politician rating form. And so, nothing special here, just typical Angular stuff. Here's the function that happens when they click the submit button. Here's the function that happens when they click one of those bells, stuff like that. Nothing really big here. Where the magic starts to happen is the service. So if I go to the politician rating service, can everyone still read this without being in presentation mode? It's a lot easier for me to use like that. So this is the politician rating service, which its functionality is to send requests from the views to the API and then return the information back. That's its single responsibility. So what it does is, so that we have this review politicians method in here that takes the user ID, the politician ID, what the comment is, and what the scores of all the bells are together, and it creates a model here. And the model itself gets passed to API, politician controller, and then the review politician method on the controller. This is sent over as a JSON object in this model, so it's really easy to work with on the back end instead of sending sending all 4 of these as a URL parameter. So that's one of the things that I do there is I just create a JavaScript object and then pass that over to the API. Stop me if you guys have questions as I go.
So on the API request there, what would you do to prevent people from just posting to your API from an external source to spam it?
Laravel has built-in CSRF protection, and so that's enabled. It creates a user token for every session, and checks that user token on the back end. It's added as a hidden field to the form, and so it can't be spoofed. And so that's actually submitted along and stuff like that.
So a minute ago, you said that between the blade syntax and the Angular syntax, the handlebars could get a little bit confusing when using one or the other. I know Laravel 4 had the ability to change the
Laravel 5 is even better. I don't remember how I did that, but they actually have something where you can go in and change. I think you put an @ symbol before your curly braces, and that's Angular. Anything that has an @ symbol before curly braces, Blade won't process it.
Oh, okay.
So it not necessarily even has to be Angular. You can use any of the template languages. And that's, you don't have to enable that. That's built in.
Okay.
Blade right now is 5. So I never have a page that has both PHP and Angular on there because it's kind of a separation concerns issue for me. I'll break things out into directives for Angular and then just call the directive on the PHP page. So I didn't run into any conflicts there. So we'll go, so from the front end, it's calling the URL API politicians, review politicians. Anyone familiar with Laravel knows about Laravel routing. So we'll just take a quick look at this. So it's looking for API and then politicians. And this points, so this points anything on the /API/politicians route to the politicians controller, which is right there. Any questions about that, about routes? Routing's pretty similar for everything. Now we'll go into the politician controller. So everything Laravel supports very easy. Look at that. Unused directive. That's bad on me. Laravel supports dependency injection and version of control right out of the box. Pretty easy. And so is everyone familiar with dependency injection? So that's a whole nother, that could be like a whole nother topic, but basically anything that any other classes that your class requires, you don't want to new them up inside of the class. Because then if something changes with the class that it's dependent on, you're gonna have to go into the other class and you're gonna have to refactor that. So what dependency injection does is you define an interface. So for example, I have a politician repository interface, and here in the constructor, I'm just saying, hey, give me an object that implements this interface. And then you set up a, where's that at?
Kernel.
It's a little bit different in Laravel 5. Maybe it's in my app service provider. So then I have one configuration file that says, hey, anytime you're requesting a politician repository interface, give them this eloquent politician repository class. So the advantage of this is that if I decided to migrate the application over to Doctrine from Eloquent, I wouldn't have to refactor my controller, because the controller is just implementing methods that are defined on the interface. I would just make sure my Doctrine repository uses the same method names. The implementation is actually inside the repository and not inside the class. So that's kind of quick. The TLDR, as far as dependency injection goes, it's black magic. And if you were doing this in the 1700s, you'd be burned. So, there's a little dependency injection in there, so do that. Really, it's really hard to explain to somebody, but once you start using it, it just kind of clicks. So, so let's go down. Let's find the review. Okay, so here's the review politician method that gets called from that API. So it gets the JSON model from the request. So now I have that same object from the Angularjs service here, user ID, politician ID, comment ratings, the exact same object with the exact same properties in my controller. So I don't have to remember what maps to what. I get the user ID out, model user ID, politician user ID, and then I just make sure that both of those IDs are valid in the system, that someone's not trying to spoof me. So then I call the review repository with the user ID and the politician ID to see if that user has already reviewed that politician. If it's empty, if it comes back from the database as an empty object, so that's one of the things that Mongo does. If you query an object by ID and it doesn't find one, it's going to return back an empty object for you. So then I can check. And so at this point, I know that this user has not reviewed this politician, so we can go ahead and create this review. I set up the Radians Array, all of those little bells for the 10 different amendments. I stick those into an array, and then I make a new politician with the user ID, the politician ID, the ratings, and the comment that as well. And so that's the flow for doing a rating. I don't need to return anything to the view at that point. It's already done, and that's how that flows through. So I do want to show a path to go through it where things are returned to the front end, so you can kind of see how that works. So we can look in the same politician's rating service here, and let's look at the politician service. So this is a very simple service. It just has one method to get a list of all the politicians. So, all right, got that done. Okay. So now we're in a method whose responsibility is to get all the politicians in the database and then send it to the front end to populate that list we saw when I first brought the application up. So first we do a database query. So let me jump on this real quick, going back to that whole dependency injection issue I had. So see, the controller just knows that the politician repository has a method called GetAll. It doesn't know what GetAll does. It just knows like, hey, I can say GetAll, it's going to give me all the politicians. The actual database implementation, the query, is inside that repository file itself. So I could just completely switch database systems, make a new repository, make sure that its GetAll method is called GetAll, and I don't have to refactor my controller at all. So that's a big advantage of using dependency injection. The other advantage is testing. If I wanted to test this class, I don't want to test the repository. I want to test the politician controller class, so I can mock the repository to just bring me back fake data that I'm expecting, and then I can run my test based on that. We can talk more about dependency injection afterwards, but like I said, it's a huge topic itself. So I just do a little query here to get all the politicians. There's only certain fields that I want to get back from the database that I'm going to display. I don't need to get everything. Then I create an empty ViewModels object here. When you're sending your domain object back to your front end, you don't want to send the domain object. It's going to have a bunch of crap in it that the view's not concerned about. You want to simplify it, and so you create a view model from the domain object that has just the information that you need for the view. It could have added stuff. So for example, when I'm displaying a review on the front page here, this review itself, it has 3 different aggregates going on in it. First, it has a user. It has what politician it is, and then it has an actual review. And so instead of sending back a user object, a review object, and a politician object to the front end, I create a view model that contains that information, pull the information from the other 3 domain classes into that view model, and then return that view model back to the view. So
How do you sort the comments of the reviews?
the reviews, there's a politician review object. So there's a domain class, an entity for politician review, and it has a comment property on it. So a politician review has the user ID, so that's the user who wrote the review. It has the politician ID, it's the ID of the politician it reviews for. It has a property that contains all the scores from the 10 amendments, and then it has a property for holding the comment. So back to this. So we get all the politicians that are in the database. I create this empty ViewModel array, and then I loop through all the politicians. So here's a good example. So I have all the politicians first. If we look at the list of politicians, it also includes, I believe, the average score of that politician right there. So we have the politician domain and we have the politician review domain objects both going into this view model. So instead of returning both of those objects and doing logic on the front end to get all the information, I'm going to make one brand new class object called a view model class that has just the information that I need. So that's what we're going through here. So first I get all the politicians, and then I'll loop through them, and then I'll find any reviews for that politician's ID. So now I have a collection object of all of that politician's reviews. If there are no reviews, they have an average rating of 1. That's just what the default is. If there are reviews, I'll go through here and I'll get the average score of all of those bells here. And then I'll make a politician list model. So this is a view model here. It's a completely different object. And these are just dumb classes. There's no logic in these. Their sole purpose is to hold information and then give it to the view. So you'll look here, it's just a bunch of public properties. There's nothing special here. But these are all the properties that I need to display a review on the front page.
So in this politician controller here, why is the default rating 1 as opposed to 0 or null? It seems like it gives the illusion that there's a low rating for a politician when there's no rating.
It's what the guy wanted, man. So then I get the review. I create a model here so I have a politician list model because we're on the politician list page. It contains the ID of the politician, their name, state, office, party, if they're a candidate or not, their photo. Actually, I could take that out because I'm not really using that. Whatever district they are, if they're in the House, their slug for the URL, and then whatever their average rating is from that. And then I return this view models array back to as a JSON response back to the service. So then we look at the politician service. They're just returning that promise. List JS. Okay. And so at this point, the view itself has an array of all of those reviews, of all those politicians. And so then in Angular, I can just do an ng repeat down here for every politician in that politician array. And when I access that information, I can just do politician.slug, politician.office, politician.party.state, and then use the politician.rating for it to loop through and display the correct image for the ratings, whether it's yellow or grayed out. So I see a lot of confused faces out there.
How do you set what the view model is going to look like on the front end once you has that information.
How do I what?
How do you set what the view model is going to look like on the front end?
This is a HTML Angular template right here that has the information, and so this is what it actually looks like and gets rendered. So it's just a div class with some CSS on it, and then you use Angular to render the information to the front end. Is that what you're asking? Okay. So I can get into a little bit of front end stuff for you. So I use, if we want to get into that, if we have some time. So
I guess I'm curious, if you were to misspell slug here, would it know, like, is there any kind of IDE binding? Like,
actually, since this is JavaScript, it will display a console error in your Google Chrome DevTools, or I think every browser has DevTools.
but you wouldn't see it in PHP Storm.
But you would not see it in PHP Storm. Because this is actually a JavaScript.
Right.
This itself is an HTML file.
But it doesn't know that it's bound to that
Right.
object.
Yeah. So when the list is ran, so this is the directive for the politician list. It runs this initialize function, and there it does that's where it calls the politician service to get to the back end, and then returns it back, and then sets it on the scope to this politician's variable. And so then the template for that directive has the politician object that it can just call the properties off of. But you'll get an error in Chrome that says undefined, like politician.slub is undefined. Right,
So when you're actually viewing all politicians on the page, for each politician, it has to recalculate the average rating every time?
Nope. It just does one API call, gets all the information back, and then Angular holds on to it and then displays it.
Okay.
So I drew another picture. Anyone else use OneNote? I think it's great. So this is kind of the flow through the program that we just went through. So it all starts with a directive or view. It doesn't necessarily need to be an Angular directive. It can be any kind of view file. So it can be the blade syntax. It could be an Angular directive. And that calls a service, which creates a model and then passes that to a controller. If you're creating a new domain object, so say they can't create politicians in this application, obviously, but if you did, I would use a converter object that would take the model that's passed in from the front end and converts it into a domain object. I wouldn't actually new up that in the controller itself. Then it gets persisted to the database. And then when it comes out of the database, you use a mapper to create that view model, and then send that view model back to the service, which then again sends it back to the view. So that's really, I mean, that's all that I have as far as this project goes in domain-driven design. Oh yeah, absolutely.
So for the view models, you've got like a politician listing page and a politician detail page. So do you have different, I'm sorry if I missed it, but do you have a different view model for each one?
Yeah,
Or is the
there's,
data the same?
yeah, and some views have multiple view models. And I can take you through that here.
So I guess my question is more geared toward like the way I would ordinarily think about this. I would probably have like a toJSON method on the politician, and that would output all, because with your design you've got the mapper and then the view model, but the benefit that you've got there is to have just the data needed for whatever the view is.
Yeah.
So rather than having a two listing page JSON and a two detail page JSON, you've got a separate.
You'd take that, because that's not business logic. The domain itself isn't concerned with how this information is being displayed. It's business rules, and that's what that is. The controller is just there to coordinate everything, so you wouldn't want to put it there. So you create a mapper class that'll take in a domain object and then return the view model. And then the view model itself is just tailored to exactly what you need for the view that it's tied to. So did you get all that in there?
Yeah.
Okay. So if we look in here, view composers. So, so this view composer here for the politician detail page, it has 1, 2, 3, 4 different view models that it can return depending on what it's looking at. So, so this is itself is the politician detail model here. In order to make the mapping easier, I created a politician model. That way, so if I look at my politician detail model, it has a politician, a rating, and recent reviews. And so politician detail model is the view model, but it has some supporting classes in there that just makes mapping things easier. That way it can just be, politician, or it can be review.politician.id, stuff like that. So you can have, typically you would only be returning one view model to the view, but you can have multiple supporting dummy plain classes in to support that. So we can look at a little bit at how I do CSS. This is the first, typically I've done less. This is the first project that I've done SAS with. Laravel 5 has moved as a whole over to both SAS and Gold. And so it was a good opportunity for me to learn something different. There's not a lot different between SAS and less that I found. So we can look here. I start off, so you have one main SAS file, and everything else is broken into, every view has its own SAS file. Every component, like the review on the front page, would have its own SAS file. That way, everything's broken up the same way that it is on the back end. That's why it's easier to find where to go change things. And so then everything here gets imported, and then Gulp concatenates it for you. I have one variable file that I define certain variables that I use throughout. So, the red, the blue, the gray, and then that way when I'm doing other less files, I can just reference it by that. I use a technique for writing CSS called BEM, Block Element Modifier. Some of you might be familiar with that. But the whole point of that is to eliminate a bunch of nested CSS. That way, when you're working on things and you need to modify a certain class, you don't have to find the more specific identifier in order to be able to override that. And you can stop using important tags. So everything's broken into a block. So there's a politician list block, which is list. Try to find it. I forgot what I named it. Politicians list. Okay. So there's a politician list block, and so everything inside the list for the politician list has is a politician list class, and then 2 hyphens, and then whatever element it is. So if we look here, so the tabs that run along the top of the page here are inside a class called politician list tabs. And then that way, when I write my list here, I can target those specifically. And I'm not nesting politician list, then another class, and then another class. I'm accessing those directly. So if I need to make a modifier later on, I can just target that and not have to worry about all of the nesting. And so then politician list tab here. Of course, nesting for like after properties and hover and stuff like that is completely fine when you're using SAS, because that'll get compiled out and stuff like that. So it keeps things really clean. It makes it easier to go back and make changes and tweaks and stuff to your CSS later. And if you're interested in more on that, it's just BEM, Block Element Modifier, CSS. So there's a getbin.com that has an introduction to it. So it's a pretty nice way to make CSS more tolerable to work with. So, does anyone have any more questions?
So using that type of pattern, so you have politician list tab,
Mhm.
and then you have another element inside politician list tab, which would be politician list tab,
Right here, yeah.
correct? Okay,
Yeah.
so like with SAS, you've done the nesting with the active and after and hover state.
Right.
So using that BEM, you wouldn't just nest politician tab inside of the politician tabs.
Right, because in that case, you've got a very specific CSS identifier. It's only give me elements that are .politician tabs inside of a politician
Right.
tab, and so it'll make it harder that if you need to reuse or modify it later on to change that.
So if you were to reuse politician list tab somewhere outside of the tabs class.
Right.
Yeah.
Then you'd have to make sure that you give it a very specific modifier. A better example for that might be the actual reviews. So these reviews show up in a few different places. They show up here, they show up down here, and then they show up on the bottom of the politician page itself.
And so if you're using some patterns that you know you're going to reuse,
Yeah.
it's better to keep it.
And so this one, I just have a review. I just have one SAS file for the reviews that has the information for that in there. And then I can place this anywhere. And if I wanted to modify it for a particular page that it's on, it's going to be a lot easier for me to be able to do that because I'm not going to be fighting a bunch of very specific nested selections.
Right.
Like with Bootstrap. You know, that's a huge concern with Bootstrap when you're trying to change like anchor tags in the navigations or something because everything is so nested and very, very specific. Because the way that CSS defines those, the most specific identifier is the one that wins out.
So to adopt the BEM attitude, do you have to go all in? Like, do
No.
you still use?
I don't go all completely in at all with it, but some people do. You can. There's actually there's a Cardinal is a CSS framework similar to GitHub, except built on the block element modifier concept. So it doesn't, and it's a lot more lightweight than it's a framework for creating it more so than like Bootstrap's a library of already existing CSS styles in JavaScript and stuff like that. So it's really, so this is good, easy to build on. So it has some basic stuff in there like grids, scaffolding and stuff like that. But it's built on the BEM, so it's easier to work with and make customizations and stuff like that. I don't use it myself, but I know some guy who does. So, does anyone have anything else? Because I'll stop talking, or I'll sit up here and talk longer. You've not said anything the whole time.
I'm kind of shy.
So, all right. Well, like I said again, this isn't on GitHub. If there's any specific code you guys would want to look at, come up and talk to me, and I can create a gist or something and get that on there so you can see that code without it being proprietary, stuff like that. So, other than that, thanks for listening to me go on for however long, like an hour and something.
I actually do have one more question.
Okay, man.
So with your that entity layout, your domain map that you created, basically.
Yeah.
What if you were creating entities that have that would have more relationships with each other? Like for instance, now we've got, like you were talking about aggregates and aggregate groups. You got politicians. So basically, you're going to return one object that's going to have all of the information you need for that particular politician. Well, let's say that you had another entity for locations or something.
Right.
And so at some point, you might want to list all of the locations, which again would have data, but a location may be associated with the politician.
Mm-hmm.
Is that
Right.
making sense?
That's an entity reference, and that actually happens in here. So if you look at the politician rating itself, is an entity, it has its own ID, but it references an ID from a user and an ID from a politician.
Right.
And
Okay. So basically,
You save the referenced ID on the object that it needs to. That way, when I get a politician rating, or when I want to find a rating for a politician, I can just query it on it.
Right. Okay.
That's
So
called
same thing like relationship tables.
yeah.
Same deal.
Yeah, it's called in domain-driven design. It's called an entity reference.
What, I guess one question, I mean, forgive me because my database knowledge is really weak, but is there a point at which using that system would become like ineffectual? Like, can you think of an example where a more conventional database system would be preferable?
It's actually kind of the opposite. Because with Raven or with Mongo, it's very easy to replicate your database server. So it looks to the point to where your database is growing too large. You can just take it, make a copy of it, and have it as 2 database servers. And then that way the application will be able to query any number of databases, and they all get synced behind the scenes like that. So it will find the database server that's most responsive, and you're basically doing big web scale at that point. So you can do scaling and replication with SQL and stuff, but it's a lot more difficult in order to do that. These document-driven database systems were designed in order to be able to be scaled massively and replicated. Well, thanks, guys.
So once more, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out. I'll be putting out a message on the group to see when the next date that would work for everyone would be, and a call for speakers or ideas for what our next meetup should be. I do have 2 door prizes to give away, so this is the last call to sign up if you haven't. I'm going to be drawing off the sign-up list. So just a minute here to get a random number generator. Because I left my dice at home.
You stole that idea from me.
I totally did. Okay, so the first drawing is for this white box right here, excuse me, which is a travel coffee mug from Premier Staffing Partners, donated by Chris back here in the back, who's completely ignoring me.
I'm
No,
not
she's waving now.
ignoring you, I'm talking to Kevin, sorry.
And that one goes to Carrie Estes. Okay, and the big prize is the JetBrains license. This is a license to the JetBrains product of your choice. It's a coupon code. You go to the website, pick out the product, and you put the coupon code during checkout, and you get your thing for free. And that one goes to Emily. So if you want to hang out for a minute, I'll get that sent to you. So I guess that's it for the day. Thank you, everybody, for coming out.